Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Church Podcast. Once again, I'm joined by KJ Pugh and Paul Helm, and we have an interesting topic to talk about today, one that I'm a little nervous talking about. It's a very, very vast, complex issue, but we're here in this time of quarantine still, and we're thinking about what life looks like during that time. And so, in particular, in God's providence, we're in this time during a period where social media is a thing. And so, KJ, do you have a good Lord of the Rings quote for us to help us prepare?
I always go back to what Gandalf told Frodo. Frodo said, I wish the ring had never came to me. I wish I'd never lived to see such times. And Gandalf said, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All they have to do is to decide what to do with the time given to them.
Well, there you go. And we didn't decide to have a coronavirus outbreak. We did not decide to have social media. But nevertheless, we have both of those things. And so the question for the day is, how does social media and this sort of digital world that we're living in affect how we do life and ministry during this time of confinement? And so we've all sort of been called into quarantine for such a time as this. So guys, I want to ask the question, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having social media during this lifestyle of confinement?
I think my wife said it well when she said the big advantage of having social media, the big advantage is that we get to keep in touch with one another and see what's going on in the world around us. And the big disadvantage of having social media in this time is that we get to keep in touch with one another and see what's going on in the world around us. I knew what she meant. Let me explain what she means if you don't get it. First of all, is that living in an age of social media is a gift. In any previous point in human history, I live on the other side of the world from my family, and to hear from them, it would take writing a letter, putting it on a boat, and take ages to get correspondence. Right. Back and forth. We live in a day and age where we can have immediate interaction with one another. We can have windows into each other's daily life, and that is a gift. It is a gift, but it is a gift that we can love too much and we can abuse. Why? Because we are to be embodied people. We are people who have bodies that have limits upon them. We're meant to live in one place and one time. We're meant to share life with the people who are right in front of us. It's good to be limited to the cares and needs we can actually see and do something about. I think we're not meant to carry on our shoulders all the cares of the world and all the outrage of our friends on Facebook. Whatever our friends are outraged about, we're not meant to carry that as well from someone who's halfway around the world. You are meant to enjoy the people and meet the needs that are actually physically in front of you that you encounter. So living in a social media age, it is a gift, but it is a gift that we can love too much and abuse.
Well, and there it is. There's the complex nature of this discussion, even from your wife's quote, right? The advantage and the disadvantage are the same things. And there's so many qualifiers that you have to make. And that there's a lot of wisdom there about not bearing the burdens of the world, which can, I think we've all experienced that overwhelmed nature of interacting with Facebook, Twitter, these kind of things. Paul, do you have some thoughts on this question? Advantages and disadvantages?
Something KJ just said made me think of, there's a term some of us may be familiar with, virtue signaling, right? And I'm not necessarily one to use that term, but I think it's interesting that it highlights the way that social media, maybe a disadvantage here, causes us to respond and react to people and ideas that are really far removed from us in a lot of ways. And by responding, it can kind of puff us up and make us feel more virtuous, right? Mm-hmm. If I disagree with this article, or if I respond negatively to that development in the world, it makes me feel as if I've done something. In reality, I've done nothing other than share my opinion. Now, things do need to be said. As Christians, we believe words are very important. So that's not to say that, news is unimportant or sharing our convictions is unimportant. But the disadvantage is that there's an additional element of self-deception that's possible with thinking that me on the internet shouting is somehow making me a more virtuous person. And like KJ said, the Bible calls us to true virtue by God's grace within our limited creaturely reality, right? And so I think if we care about people, we will be kind of wary. If we really care about our neighbor, our family, people living right next to us, we will kind of need to be wary of the effects that social media has on us, kind of tricking us into thinking that we're accomplishing things or that we're really making a difference in the world, when God might be calling you to get off the phone and look at the person next to you, especially during this time. But I do think, obviously, if you care about people at the same time, you will care about social media in some sense, because that's where people are.
Okay, so
yeah.
so that statement there, I don't disagree with you, but I do want I want us to flesh that out a bit, because you just said that if you let me make sure you said it, I get it right. If you care about people to some extent, you care about social media. Now, before this crisis, there are lots of stances. I think social media in general in Christian circles is a controversial topic. Some are very engaged. Some are, take the opposite extreme and avoid it altogether. I've been in some churches that even, like, if you're on Facebook, it was a matter of church discipline. Like, I mean, there's extremes here, right? But you just made the statement that if you care about people to some extent, you care about social media. Now, do you think that this unique season that we're in should cause everyone to rethink their position? Do you think this sort of a total avoidance of social media is still an option for people, or is this quarantine forcing us into conversations we didn't want to have before? What are your thoughts on that?
So, I'm gonna play it safe and go with Jesus is always the right answer. But I think you see this tension in his life. I'm a technology person. I love to, ever since I was a kid. We were always a technology family. We had computers and the internet way before anyone else, and we were in the middle of nowhere, right? We weren't living in New York City or anything. And so growing up in that and then becoming a Christian and realizing how technology and social media and all that can be a temptation, I feel both of these realities. People are on the internet. People are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We should care about people, and that's where they are. And at the same time, my life, the life that God's calling me to, has to be intentional. And so I look at Jesus in his ministry. It's really interesting. He is clearly in the Gospels always concerned about going off and being by himself, being with the Father in prayer, reflection. And then the disciples are telling him at certain points, hey, we need to slow down. This is just too much. And Jesus says, do I not have work to do? Look at he had compassion on the crowds, right? And so you see this dual reality in Jesus's life of this intentionality of ultimately at the foundation of our lives is a love for God and a love for people. And that's going to drive us to be with God, which takes disconnecting and reflection and meditation on scripture and prayer. But then that's going to fuel us to want to be with people. And especially right now, how are you going to be with people? You have your immediate family, friends, neighbors, the limited things you can do there. But then you can do a lot through social media and through messaging people. You're using technology when you pick up the phone to call someone.
Right.
It's just a different kind of technology. So, I think this is a good call for us right now, no matter if you're a person who avoids it or who doesn't even think about how much you use it, and you notice that you're on the phone for 10 hours today once you look at your iPhone notification about screen time. No matter which person you are, I think now is a really important time. When you have more time, you're not moving around as much. This is a really important time to reflect on where you are, how you're using it. Is your life really intentionally seeking God and seeking out other people?
Right.
Good.
KJ, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, is it reasonable for Christians to rethink their stance on social media in an exceptional time? I think it is. I think it is reasonable that exceptional times ought to call for exceptional responses from us.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't use social media well, then you're missing out on connecting with a host of people that use that as a very easy and natural way for them to connect with others. If there ever was a time to reconsider being on social media, I do think it is now. But I think it depends on why you decided to disconnect yourself from social media. If you stayed away from social media because you know it triggers in your heart envy of others or anxiety over what's in the news that people are sharing, or it triggers in you a need to be right and justify yourself publicly in a forum, or it triggers in you outrage at people's outrageous opinions that they put out on the internet, then you ought to stick to working the phone, hammering out those emails in order to connect with people instead. I think social media is still not the place for you, even in a time of crisis, if you realize that's what it triggers in your heart.
I think real quick in here too, I was talking to my wife, Abby, and for a lot of people, jealousy over the way that we can portray our lives. So it might be a mom looking on Instagram, seeing the perfect pictures of another mom's children, seemingly perfect, right? Staged just right, and the house is perfectly clean. And there's a lot of jealousy, I think, that people can experience when they're comparing their lives to the way that other people's lives appear. And you can see how, that could really be a temptation for some people that might need to get away from that medium.
Right. And I'm going to speak to the other side. I agree with what you guys have said, but I'm going to speak to the other side because there are legitimate reasons to stay off social media, but there's also illegitimate reasons to do so as well. Right. And I think there is a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I say that from a perspective of I'm one who does not enjoy social media very much. There was a time in my life when I did, and I think it's evolved over time into something I do not enjoy. So I'll throw that caveat. But I do want to say there are bad reasons to stay off as well. And I think I'm not going to pretend to know all those bad reasons, but I am going to give one bad reason, and it is to pretend like it doesn't exist in the world. You do not live in a world any longer that is not heavily influenced by social media. Just as we don't live in a world that is not influenced by the printing press or telephones, we're also in a world that is influenced by social media. Like it or not, it's just reality. So you're living in this world, and if you're a pastor, you're also pastoring in that world. And so that's not a statement of saying you must be, on Facebook all the time, or you must take this stance or that stance. It's only to say you can't pretend like it doesn't exist. It does exist. It's a reality in our world. And that means we need to have very, very careful thought about how we live and communicate. And if you do make the decision to not be on social media, you need to think about how your life ought to run with that being the case. You still have the burden. You have the burden of communication on you now because people are communicating in different ways, in a way that you're abstaining from. So how do you communicate in a way that is effective in this world when you're staying off? So that's just, there's things you need to think through if you have that stance. But I agree with you, KJ. There are good reasons to stay off, and so we need to think through all the multifaceted aspects of this. In moving to this sort of next question, and maybe to get a little bit personal, in terms, let's make the assumption now that you're engaged to some extent on social media. You don't have the total abstinence view. There's still a lot to be discussed about what is wisdom in how we are communicating. To me, I think a lot of the same things that the wisdom that the Bible gives about how we use our tongue can also be applied to how we use our keyboards and your phones and how you're typing on that. So, what are some wise things to remember to make sure our online speech is edifying? And maybe, if you dare, what are some blunders you've made? Have you learned from negative experiences?
I can share some hopefully wise things that will lead right into one of my blunders, I believe. First thing I'll say is don't have a social media presence that feels completely disconnected to the way you are face to face with people in real life.
Yeah.
Someone who is a lion on their keyboard, but is a lamb in person, just feels so disjointed. Or even, I know people who are kind people, but they just sound unhinged on the internet for some reason. Don't have a social media presence that feels completely disconnected with the way you are in real life. Also, remember, I think about this, remember, one day your descendants will come back and look at your social media archives and be like, man, my great-grandfather really cared about politics or something random. You
or baby otters.
Yes. Remember your descendants will one day come to the archives to see what grandpa was like, and how do you want to be remembered? Think about that as you post things. Also, remember, social media, particularly Facebook, Instagram, it is meant to be, I think, it is meant to be the highlight reel of your life. Okay, no one expects you to post all the boring bits of life. No one expects you to post all the hard things, the mess ups. It is meant to be the highlight reel. I think that's what Paul was mentioning, that some people struggle with envy because that's the nature of it. Don't feel like you post a picture of your smiling kids and you have to say, you should have seen them for the hour before we took this picture. They were at each other's throats. You don't have to qualify whatever good things you post with a ton of bad stuff in your description just to make, just because it is the highlight reel of your life. Also, know this.
Which is important. I just jump in there. It's important to remember that when you're looking at other people's as well. Like this isn't their, they're not trying to reveal everything about their life. They're revealing what they're choosing to reveal.
Right. What they want to remember. Right. Also, just as a general rule for myself, I don't share news on social media because I don't have the time, and I don't think you do either, to be a researcher to find out the truthfulness of every article you come across. And when you do share news, people can quickly type you just by the source of the news you share, not to mention the content of the message. Because, even news that happens in the world is politicized these days. So typically, just as a general rule, I don't share news. When I do, I usually regret doing it. And also, if you do share news, I have never felt edified by reading the comment section on a news article, ever, never, ever. And so I realized if I did post news, the comments on that is probably not gonna be something edifying to others and edifying to myself. My biggest recommendation, hopefully it's a wise word, that leads into mistakes I've made, is don't take the bait from controversialists online. People who just want to stir the pot, stir up controversy. Don't take the bait. My biggest social media blunders have all been me taking the bait. There's this somewhat famous meme of a wife calling to her husband. He's sitting at his desk on the computer. Honey, are you coming to bed? And his reply is, no, I can't. Someone is wrong on the internet. I've got to correct this. Someone is wrong on the internet. And let me tell you, Facebook to me is the worst possible medium for debate, because everyone wants to have the last word. This has been my big blunder, is thinking of correcting someone's opinion. I give what I think to be a thoughtful response. It took me a lot of time in writing. I pop it down there, and then 15 minutes later they respond with something else. I'm like, oh, here's another thing I got to write.
Yeah, and then you got to spend another 15 minutes. Yeah,
it's never ending. And I think the first time, and maybe the only time, I just wasted a complete day responding to a couple of people. You can get caught up in this, and I would say that is my biggest blunder, and I encourage you not to take the bait to get into online debates, because everyone wants to have the last word, and not everyone can.
Yeah, this gets into kind of someone might think of the proverb, right? Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Now, then they might say, well, look, yeah, but the next verse says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. And I think we could say, oh, no, we still believe that. We just don't think the answering a fool should happen in this way. You could privately message them. You could, if you know them, you could call them, text them. Next time you see them in person, say something. But I think KJ's right. Doing it online just creates more and more strife. I have also wasted maybe even a day or 2 days of continued, strife in responding to people and having to, again, you start justifying yourself too. Of like, I'm going to show them why I'm right. I'm going to show them that I actually know more on this than I have a friend right now who's a flat earther, and he is constantly trying to stir the pot. And I thought, should I? I'm not going to answer any of his posts, but should I message him and tell him, hey man, like, you need to be concerned for your soul with the way that you're thinking and the kind of strife that you're living. But no, I think fake news would be my thing that I think we have to remember, that there are things that are being distributed intentionally by bad actors to suck you in and to bring you into a place that's not healthy. And Christians sometimes, and I have definitely fallen for it, Christians can fall for it. And the credibility that we lose when we repost things that are not true. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a research article that's not really good research or not even real at all. Maybe it's, whatever it might be. There are millions of ways that these things are done to stir up the pot, culturally, socially, politically. And for Christians to not be discerning, I mean, I think your advice is good, KJ, to just assume that you don't have the time to research this or that thing to really know if what you're reposting is helpful or accurate or not. Even with the coronavirus, I know that the people have said, hey, stick to the CDC, stick to the World Health Organization websites if you can, because these are the places where the information is not being biased. There's always going to be bias in anything, right? But they're not news articles being biased, written in a certain way. They're simply trying to present the facts and the latest solid information that we have. So I think Christians can come up in that. And more kind of generally, I think that social media encourages us to respond immediately. And so a lot of us can put our unformed opinions and unformed reactions out there. And I think that's okay in personal conversation. That's how we grow and get sharper, right? Yeah, you're putting it out for everyone to read.
The world's not interested in your next hot take on.
Yeah. You and your friend talking is that's how we sharpen our thinking and kind of help each other think through issues. But when you put it online in the public sphere, the situation where bosses nowadays or people who are hiring, they're going to look at your social media if you're a candidate, and they're going to see how you present yourself. Mm-hmm. And you don't want them seeing a bunch of reaction, kind of emotional reactions and unformed opinions and poorly researched articles you're reposting, and you're going to come across as a person who's not balanced, not responsible, whatever it might be. For Christians, there's a spiritual reason for this. We want to be good witnesses, and we want to build unity, and people can misunderstand our intentions for what we're saying. So this kind of happened to me I posted some stuff 2 years ago, and I think someone mentioned to Abby, my wife, an interpretation of something about me that wasn't true at all, based on maybe something I reposted. and just we don't necessarily want to put that in people's minds. We want to be thoughtful of the way we put things out there.
Yeah, yeah, and one of my main thoughts on this question concern. I mean, I make a lot of applications of the way the Bible talks about the use of the tongue to the way we communicate in all manners, which includes social media. And I think one pitfall that I think a lot of people make when I just observe what they do is there's a lack of understanding that the post that I post on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, I'm communicating that to everyone in the world. Now, specifically, we're communicating that to the people who follow us, maybe, and we can look at that. But the reality is we're putting it out there for all to read, okay? And so when the Proverbs talk about something about like the apt word in season, right? Before you post something that would be wise, you need to make sure that what you're posting is appropriate for everyone everywhere. And if it is not appropriate for everyone everywhere, then you better be careful in what you put on there. And so it does involve things like politics. You may have very strong political views, but you also, even with those views, you have to ask the question, is it good for everyone to hear these views in this way at this time? And there is appropriate times to talk about political issues. There's appropriate times to talk about flat earth creation. But is the appropriate way to do it in a public forum where everyone hears, right? And that is what Facebook is, which is why I believe you shouldn't be rebuking people on Facebook. Why? Because that's a public shaming, because it's in front of everyone. And I think when we're thinking about wisdom in the way we communicate, I think there is a care in our witness that we need to just be aware that the person who's receiving the message I'm saying is everyone. It's every person. And even if you compare it to us as preachers, the way we preach, we're very careful to write our sermons in a way that the particular audience that we're the congregation that we're preaching to is going to hear it. So if I'm preaching at a denominational event to a group of pastors, I'm going to preach very differently than I am at the homeless shelter downtown. And I'm going to preach differently if I'm in my home church in Alabama versus in my church in Paris that has 31 different nationalities. Why? Because the audience matters when I'm approaching how I talk, how I communicate. And again, social media communication is communication to the entire world. And so there is a care that must go into that. And I just asking one last question here of you guys. And, this is the International Church podcast. And so I want to ask a question that applies to an international church here. Because in talking about social media, it's something I've learned a good bit is that different cultures have very different approaches to social media. And I'll talk a little bit and frame this question along those lines. When I first moved to France, Facebook was a few years old. It wasn't that old at the time, but it didn't take me long to realize that the French friends that I met had a very different approach to Facebook. They had Facebook and it was a thing, but they had a very different approach to it than in the U.S. In the U.S., typically if someone put a photo of me up and tagged me or something, I was excited, and generally people liked it when I did that to them because it was, oh, you put a picture of me on Facebook. That's, it's like, if it was a bad photo, they may not like it, but generally the idea of sharing a photo of doing things together was a positive. But in France, it was not at all the case, and I learned it the hard way. I remember when I became friends, I didn't know who they were because they didn't have in their profile photo. It wasn't actually a photo of them. And I remember there was one point in which I had met a friend and tagged a picture of them and their family. And I got a scolding message saying, take those photos down because it was seen as a bad thing to post photos on Facebook. But on the complete other side, my wife is from the Philippines, and it's a completely different approach to photos on Facebook. They love photos, they love taking pictures, and they have no problem putting all the photos on Facebook, even some that I'm less comfortable with. And so, just in terms of those two cultures, which are not mine, both of those cultures have different approaches to it than my culture. Might be an important topic to discuss. How do different cultures, and thinking of cultural differences in social media, how does that affect things? Because we have an expectation that in one-on-one situations, there's going to be things we don't understand about each other. Do we carry those same sensitivities onto our online world, into social media? You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just not having as much experience as you've had, I'm just aware, hearing what you're saying, of the challenge, right? Of how there's so many different customs, expectations. And so it's very encouraging to know that the gospel unites people and brings them together into one body, one church, from every different background, language, experience. But that does highlight the challenge of where we have to really hold very closely to the gospel and find unity in the gospel, and realize that a lot of our opinions or ways of doing things can potentially cause an offense, or just be not very thoughtful, come across as not thoughtful to other people. And you're going to step on people's toes, and I'm sure you apologize, right? And you made up for that.
Yes.
But I think it's going to continually highlight for us that we have to come together around the gospel and know that we're going to be offended from time to time and offend others. And it's going to be a learning experience, a humbling experience. But thank goodness that there's power in the gospel to actually keep us united, because there are so many more factors than we realize. To me, being a national church highlights my hope and desire for myself to grow in this area of being kind of a globally minded Christian who can have empathy and understand some of those differences. And I think all of us would benefit from that, of not just seeing our Christian experience from our own perspective. So in my case, the American Christian experience, but really growing to have empathy and understanding other people's experience and their kind of expectations, and being shaped in a good way. I think it's going to cause more humility if we're open to it.
AJ?
Yeah. So if the question is, how can a diverse international community like we have use social media in a way that minimizes the conflict it can create? I would say first, we need to work hard at cultivating a culture of graciousness in our church community. There may be more opportunity for diverse opinions because we've got 30 plus different nationalities in our church family at once, but we do have a unique advantage in being an international church, in that there's already this natural graciousness toward one another. Everyone's coming in realizing we are from different places, we have different backgrounds, we have different cultures that we're bringing in, as opposed to being a part of a monocultural church in the American South or anywhere else in the world, a French church, anywhere else in the world where there is more of a unified culture and mindset, and you're the only outsider coming in. We have a kind of a natural culture of graciousness that we need to celebrate, and we need to encourage that to continue blossoming, particularly as people are coming with different sets of opinions about what is the proper way to do things, and different political views, all kinds of differences coming together. One big thing I think we can do is just agreeing together to refuse to be offended on behalf of your country or your culture. Having lived in Europe for over 5 years, I was struck right away about how often I just overhear people talking about my home country and culture. You overhear conversations about America, and as you're sitting down in a restaurant, that people talk about America much more than Americans talk about anywhere else in the world. And I was having all these conversations about things like guns and politics, presidents that I never had in America that I was having over here. And I just had to learn very quickly not to be offended, not take offense. It's good to interact with humor in those situations. And for me to realize, just because someone on social media shared one article they read about life in America, I don't have to be offended because they're not an expert by reading one article about my home and my culture. That doesn't make them an expert. But also, the shoe is on the other foot with me. Is me reading one article on India or Mongolia doesn't make me an expert on life in India or Mongolia. And so I probably shouldn't share that thing because someone could take offense and say, no, that's not the way it is at all. I'm from there. This isn't the way it is. So it's refusing to be offended on behalf of our country and culture, I think, is a big deal. So for me, kind of bottom line, make social media the place where you share your life, not all your expert opinions on everyone in the world.
Well, and that, going back to what, Paul talked about credible news sources, I heard someone talk, that conversation you're having about sort of not being offended when people are talking about your home country. I heard an American respond to a European one time about, I know what you think about America. It's whatever CNN told you to believe. And it was kind of funny because the European sort of, I realized it was true. And I'm not saying it's true of everyone. I'm just saying that typically, when we're reasoning about cultures we know nothing about, we've never been there. We're just dependent on hearsay, and whatever the opinion of our source is becomes the opinion that we're propagating, whether it's true or not.
And the only thing that makes the news is the bad news. The only thing that makes the news in your country or another country is usually the bad news of that country, not the everyday things that are good.
Right.
So I would say, again, bottom line, make social media the place where you share your life, not your expert opinions, and where you share your loves, especially your ultimate love of Jesus. That should flow out of you in every medium that you interact. And I think we stand at a unique cultural moment where Christians can show their love, their hope, their trust in Jesus, and that shine out in the midst of all the fear and anxiety around us.
Right. And even as we're talking about this question as it relates to the international church and the cultural conflicts that can happen, it's so important in all things international church to be slow to be offended. And I think you're bringing it you're wrapping the bow on it here when you're bringing us back to the gospel. It is the gospel that creates this community, this supernatural community that's willing to not be offended, that's willing to to come together under the banner of the gospel and to judge each other graciously. Always looking for the gracious interpretation of things rather than being offended. And at the same time, the being careful to not offend with what we post, realizing that what we post, everyone will see, and we do not want to be a stumbling block for brothers and sisters from other countries. And having that kind of mindset in the way that we interact. So I don't want to have the position of you're so afraid to say anything, but at the same time, having this sort of wisdom in the way that we talk and handle ourselves for the glory of God, for the good of His church. Interesting discussion today, guys. Any closing thoughts or comments?
I just think I would direct people to look at Romans 15, verse 5 through 7. So, that's where Paul says, welcome one another as you've been welcomed by Christ. And he has this prayer, may the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony that with one another, so that together you may with one voice glorify God. And I think if that's the ultimate aim, that our social media presence would be a witness to people when they see Christians from all different backgrounds, not perfectly expressing themselves at all times, but in general, having a united kind of front of declaring hope in the gospel, and like KJ said, sharing their loves, ultimately their love for Christ. That's going to be a witness to people, and that's what we want, rather than a fractured Christian community fighting with each other, blasting each other on their comment sections, but rather this beautiful harmony that would come and that people would see on social media. I think that's what we hope for. That's our prayer.
I'll just say that the church does show that we are a supernatural community when we're people who probably don't agree on much of anything else, but we've all come together believing the same announcement of good news from God, of salvation through Jesus Christ. And that makes us a family together. And all the other differences, it pushes aside and we grow together. So that's what I would say.
Amen.
Amen.